must be a conflict between science and religion, while Professor Hossein Kamali provides a negative response. No, there must not be a conflict between science and religion. Before introducing the first debater, let me say two things. First, there will be a short question and answer part at the end of the debate. If you have any questions, please write them down in the Zoom chat box and send them to my colleagues, not to me, as I'm busy moderating. Please keep your questions short, to the point, and clear, and specify to whom your question is addressed, if not both. Second, you can use English automatic subtitles by clicking on the live transcript button just down there. Okay, the debaters agreed that Dr. Smith would begin the debate. Now let me introduce him. Dr. Tiddy Smith has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Otago, New Zealand, an MA in philosophy from the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and a BA in philosophy from the University of Otago. He has taught philosophy at the University of Otago and the University of Indonesia. His research interests include philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, and epistemology. His publications include The Methods of Science and Religion, Epistemologies in Conflict, quite well relevant to our debate tonight, published in 2019 by Lexington Books. Now, let us see how Dr. Tiddy Smith, in his 10 minutes opening statement, provides a positive answer to the question, must there be a conflict between science and religion? Dr. Smith, the virtual floor is yours, please.
Thank you for your introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, taking part in this debate all the way from New Zealand at the moment. Normally I would be in Indonesia, but back home visiting, which is very lovely. So anyway, today we're talking about science and religion. What's important, or what do these two things have in common? Well, they both seek to provide answers to some pretty big questions about human beings and our place in the world. What exists? Is there life after death? Where did human beings come from? What was the earth like 10, 20, or 100,000 years ago? Now, sometimes there are religious claims that agree with the claims of science. When the Yoshida Shinto priest taught that the Japanese race were descended from the sun, he was not entirely wrong. After all, the material required to build a living being is first born in the death throes of supernovae. It brings to mind Carl Sagan's famous quote, "The nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff." So the Shinto priest wasn't so wrong after all. But sometimes there is not really any agreement to be found. Some young Earth creationists, for example, argue that the universe is only about 6,000 years old. Now, if the scientists are right, then the young Earthers have underestimated by about 13 billion years. No small stuff to sweat. And some Vedic scholars, on the other hand, argue that the universe is 300 trillion years old, overshooting the scientists' estimate by about 310 trillion. Now, I will argue in this debate that there does exist a conflict between science and religion. And if I can be specific, I think that this conflict is about how we should go about answering those very deep and important questions that I mentioned, the ones about what exists, what causes what human beings really are, and what their place in the universe is. And the strongest claim that I will make here is this: we should never try to find answers to these sorts of very deep and important questions by looking to religion, or looking to religious scripture, or appealing to faith, whatever that is, or by relying on the authority of so-called religious experts like priests, imams, bishops, or shamans. Religion simply can't help us to critically investigate the world around us because it doesn't use the right tools. Now, my opponent, as you'll soon hear, wants you to believe the opposite. There is no global or permanent conflict between science and religion. Hossein wants you to believe that everything is, or at least could be, hunky-dory between science and religion. Both of them together make up part of a genuine discourse which might be thought of as a wider shared quest for answers. As Hossein writes in one of his many articles on this topic, science and religion ask and offer answers to questions about the what, the why, and the how. Different as their answers have been, both science and religion have proved to be integral to the lived experience of humans and the worlds, with an S, I might add, that they inhabit. Well, that sounds really nice, doesn't it? A fairy tale ending. But as with all fairy tales, I think that this one is ultimately a fiction. Hossein is right that science and religion seek to answer many of the same questions. And he's also right that their answers to these questions have often been quite different. And yet, where Hossein says that both science and religion together are integral to the lived experience of human beings in their quest for knowledge, I simply reject this claim. Science and religion do ask many of the same questions. They answer these questions quite differently at times. And when they do answer differently, we have no better option available than to suppose that the religious answers to these questions are just plain wrong. So we don't need religion in the way, or in the very same way, that we need science. Okay, so what does it mean for a conflict to hold between science and religion? Seems like a pretty silly claim, really, doesn't it? I mean, obviously, it's not some kind of organized violent conflict like the one going on in Ukraine. The streets aren't filled with scientists in their white coats lobbing hand grenades at mosques. And neither do we find Buddhist monks in their orange robes sabotaging observatories at the weekend. So how else can we think about the conflict? Well, the most popular idea is that it's some kind of claim about the history and progress of science. Religion, the idea goes, has typically inhibited scientific progress. The history between science and religion is characterized as a tense standoff, in the course of which, whenever science has taken 2 steps forward, religion has demanded 1 step back. Now, supporters of this version of the conflict theory will usually point to certain episodes in the history of science. They'll point to things like the trial of Galileo, or the burning of the cosmologist Giordano Bruno at the stake, or the condemnation of 1277, during which the teaching of Aristotelian physics was prohibited by the papacy. Or they might point to the so-called monkey trials that persisted in the United States up until the turn of the 21st century, trials aimed to inhibit the dissemination of Darwinism. Now, these have all been cases in which the dissemination of new scientific ideas was indeed suppressed by religious authorities. So is that how we should think of the conflict? Has religion regularly inhibited scientific progress through its history? Well, I don't think so. I actually reject this account of the conflict thesis, even though it's typically the most popular form. So this is something that at least me and Hossein can agree about. I think, as he probably does too, that this is a historically inaccurate account, and I think that it locates the conflict between religion and science in the wrong place. Now, although I think that some of these historical episodes can be symptomatic of a conflict between science and religion, I don't think that we can point to these sorts of historical case studies in and of themselves as the locus of the conflict. In other words, these historical episodes of hostility are a symptom of the disease, but they're not the disease itself. So why do I reject this historical form of the thesis? Probably just for the very same reasons that many of you do. And in fact, probably for the same reasons that Hossein does. For every example of a scientific theory held back by religious authorities, we might find just as many examples of scientific theories that have been promoted or lauded or even funded by religious organizations. when cosmic microwave background radiation was detected by Wilson and Penzias in 1964, indicating that the universe began with a so-called Big Bang. This new commitment to a discrete beginning of the universe was taken by many religious authorities to provide evidence for a transcendental divine cause of the universe. If there was a Big Bang, the idea went, then God might have pulled the trigger. And modern theistic apologists like William Lane Craig, for example, support something like this picture, wherein the Big Bang is seen as the direct result of divine action. So, some scientific theories have been greeted with enthusiasm by religious believers. Others have been met with ambivalence, and only a few have been met with real overt hostility. But, as I see it, the conflict is not a conflict between opposed theories of how the world might be. It's a conflict between religion as a way of investigating the world and science as a way of investigating the world. It's fundamentally an epistemological conflict between two totally different methodologies.
2 more minutes.
Science, 2 more minutes, thank you. Science, on the one hand, with its various empirical tools and explanatory devices, and religion, on the other, with its own unique occult ways of justifying knowledge claims. And it's my claim that there's no common ground to be found between these two activities. To be specific, the methods of religion, such as faith, appeals to sacred scripture, or divine revelation, could never be adopted by science as a matter of necessity. And the reason is clear. Science begins with hypotheses and submits them to critical tests using methods which typically generate agreement between independent investigators, whereas religion begins with authorities from whom the facts of the matter are said to be derived. And when these facts are later justified, it's done by appeal to a range of demonstrably unreliable methods. I think I might stop there because otherwise I'm bound to overshoot the time limit. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. If I got you correctly, your position was that although science and religion might agree or disagree here and there, i.e. atomistically, their epistemological methodology is deeply different, and there lies the main conflict. Okay, so let us see how Professor Hossein Kamali would respond to that, or maybe his opening statement, 10 minutes, and then later on he will respond. Thank you, Dr. Kamali.
I express my gratitude to the organizers of this event at the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, ICCNC, especially to Dr. Ali Basiri and Dr. Hassan Masood, Mr. Sheikh al-Islami, all their colleagues at the ICCNC, and of course, to Dr. Yaser Mirdamadi, the moderator of the quarterly debate program at ICCNC. This is an important and timely initiative, and I consider it an honor and privilege for myself to participate in it. I also thank Dr. Tiddy Smith for joining me in this conversation today, and I also thank him for his concise and clear opening statement. My answer to today's debate question, must there be a conflict between science and religion, is a resounding no. There is no must in having such. Rather, I call for a revision and reformulation of the perceived relationships in science and religion, especially rejecting the assumption that science and religion must be in conflict. This is not to say that conflict has not existed, but to emphasize that an alternative conceptualization of the relationship between science and religion is required, especially in our time. Let me say a few words to clarify my position, especially because my historical understanding as well as my epistemological understanding of science and religion, differs from that which our first presenter, Dr. Tiddy Smith, so eloquently presented. First, let me say, science is central to our daily lives today. Nearly all aspects of our daily activities are impacted by science, often through the mediation of various technological applications of science, from our foods and drinks to cars, buses, trains, and planes we use for transportation, to our means of communication at home and at work, the electronic platforms that we use, not least Zoom, that many of us have become accustomed to over the past couple of years, mostly because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are using today, along with YouTube, to participate in this event from perhaps all over the world, from New Zealand to North America, from Europe to the Middle East. Wherever we may be and whoever we are, science constitutes an integral part of our life world, or our life worlds, whether we are aware and conscious about it or not. Recently, together, we all went through the big COVID-19 pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. Millions suffered. Many of us lost relatives, friends, and other people we knew or knew of from afar or up close. It was science that decisively identified the cause of COVID as a variant of the severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS-coronavirus. And then science played an instrumental role in eventually finding the solution in the form of vaccines and other medications. In fact, developing a vaccine in an unprecedentedly short time, within a year or so, was a tremendous triumph for science that we all witnessed and welcomed. Now, science tells us and warns us that there will be other pandemics in the future, some even more overwhelming and calamitous than the challenging COVID-19 pandemic that we had to face. And science promises to continue to play a key role in combating and mitigating the consequences of such disasters. Again, science is central to our lives and will continue to be so, hopefully. That said, I want to, and I need to, highlight and foreground an important caveat. Behind and beyond the word science, we must see and we must recognize and acknowledge the efforts, activities, and choices of humans. This ought to be obvious, but it's most important to emphasize and to flesh out. Science is a human institution, and I propose an institutional perspective on science and the question of the relationship between science and religion, or science and art, or science and philosophy for that matter. Most visibly, scientists stand at the core of the enterprise, the institution of science, but various other groups have key roles to deliver as well. No doubt, in the case of the scientific breakthrough concerning COVID-19, along with scientists and their associates, corporate entities such as Pfizer and Moderna in the United States, the Gamaleya Research Institute in Russia, and Sinovac Biotech in China substantively contributed to the discovery, manufacturing, distribution, and delivery of vaccines, and to controlling the pandemic worldwide. Not just individual scientists, but non-scientists, including administrators or bureaucrats, even politicians as well, had a role to play. The role of medical, so-called medical workers, not just the doctors, but also the nurses, also the so-called essential workers, was immense. It was not just science. Science was not alone in seeing us through. So going back to clarifying my position in response to the debate question for today, science, as I see it, and as I suggest that we look at it, is a human institution, built by humans, understood by humans, used by humans, and not infrequently abused by humans. Continuing along the same line of thinking, religion as an institution is made by humans, understood by humans, used by humans, and not infrequently abused by humans. I have phrased and formulated my position in a way to be clear and at the same time to avoid, or at least to sidestep, misreading and possible misunderstandings. An important corollary or upshot of this position, the two statements I just made, is that neither science nor religion is merely a set of propositions or theories, declarative or normative statements. Science is more than a bag full of theories, hypotheses, reports of empirical facts, and methodological principles. I think here, Dr. Smith and I differ. Of course, theories and empirical facts are important and germane to science. Still, science is a lot more than just that. Similarly, religion is more than a set of beliefs, convictions, speculations, or more complicated propositional attitudes. Also, religion is not simply religious authorities that were mentioned. Of course, beliefs, convictions, and speculations about the meaning and purpose of life, transcendence, and other metaphysical or theological issues are important and integral to religion. And of course, so-called religious authorities are important, have been important. Nevertheless, religion is a lot more than just that. In logical terms, this is the what I'm proposing in a nutshell, in a logical form. Neither science nor religion is reducible to some higher order logic of propositions, predicates, and quantifiers, however complex the semantics of such a logic or logical system may be.
2 more minutes.
This seemingly strong logical claim is a corollary of regarding science and religion as institutions, not merely as structured propositions, theories, propositional attitudes, etc., but rather as a densely interconnected network, or rather networks of institutional as well as individual agents and actors. I will save some of this material for later for the discussion. Yet science and religion have been in conflict, and they have been held in conflict on multiple occasions in various contexts. The point is that such conflict is not, never was, an essential or logical necessity, but invariably conditioned by historical circumstance. Again, in tandem with social, political, economic, and cultural conditions that prevail. Logically, certainly not historically, there is a must in the conflict between science and religion. There is no must, I'm saying. There is no inevitable, essential contradiction or conflict. Dabbling in intellectual history in general, and in the history of science in particular, has led me to conclude, or at least to surmise and guess, that pitting science against religion is primarily of European provenance. In other words, the conceptualization of an essential or inevitable conflict between religion and science seems to have risen and evolved in modern Europe and extrapolated from that origin, and it has expanded globally. As such, we can better understand and appreciate the discourse of science versus religion against the broader context of such historical developments as the Reformation, the French Revolution, and not least the expansion of European empires and the discourse of modernity beyond Europe, most importantly to the United States and North America. Later, during the 20th century, a new phase of science versus religion discourse materialized against the backdrop of the Cold War. My suggestion is that now, as we approach the middle of the 21st century, we should rethink the relationship in light of what history reveals, and perhaps more importantly, facing a future that we, all humans of any religion or no religion whatsoever, broaden our understanding and appreciation of the colossal challenges, not least environmental ones, that we have to face, in both as scientists, both as people of faith, also as non-scientists and people without faith. I believe jettisoning the baggage of an inevitable clash or conflict between science and religion is a necessary step in that direction. I'll say more about this in the next segment of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamali. Professor Kamali's position in a nutshell was that although there has been a conflict here and there historically, essentially, there must not be a conflict because the science and religion both are rooted in humanity of human, and historically there have been both science and religion have been much more complicated than can be depicted in a logical necessity of conflict. Okay, by the way, I forgot to introduce Professor Kamali. Sorry. Professor Hossein Kamali holds the Imam Ali Chair in Shia Studies and Dialogue among Islamic Schools of Thought at Hartford International University. Before obtaining his PhD and MA in history from Columbia University, he earned an MSc in mathematics, statistics, and operations research from New York University. His undergraduate degree was in computer and electrical engineering from Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran, Iran. Professor Kamali has taught in New York City for many years. He was an assistant professor in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Barnard College and Columbia University from 2007 to 2017. He has also taught at the City University of New York, Hunter College, and Brooklyn College. His first book in English, entitled God and Man in Tehran, Contending Visions of the Divine from the Qajars to the Islamic Republic, which was published in 2018 by Columbia University Press. His next book, A History of Islam in 21 Women, was published in 2019 by One Word Publication in the UK. Okay, now we have heard the argument of both sides in their opening statements. It is now time for each side's rejoinder. Dr. Smith, let us hear your rejoinder for 5 minutes, please.
Right. Okay. Well, okay, there are a few things I disagreed with, but a few I agreed with as well. And I think Hossein might have misjudged which of these were which. I, of course, agree that science is more than a ragtag collection of propositions. Same again for religion. These are obviously human institutions performed by humans with human interests at their heart. And I don't think there are a lot of possums running around doing possum science as such. Yes, obviously these are institutions, but it's the commitments that these institutions take up, especially with regards to their methodologies, that sets them in conflict. It's just because of what a religion is. If we take it as some sort of natural kind, right? If we actually take religions to have something in common that we can judge them to be a religion by, right? I would argue that it is their particular methodology, right? Which includes some methods that scientists would adopt, right? Includes discursive reasoning, includes argument, includes even conjecture, right? And hypothesis, but also includes a bunch of methods by necessity that science would be unwilling to take up. And this is why, for example, you won't go to many science seminars, conferences, what have you, and have the person on the stage argue that, well, their new theory is justified by the dream they had last night, for example, right? Whereas this particular form of justification is one that can be commonly found in a range of religious traditions throughout the world and through history. Now, of course, not all religions accept dreams as just that's one example, but things like divine revelation, dreams, scriptural analysis, or commitment to sacred propositions, these are the sorts of methods that are by necessity held by religions and by which we judge that they are religions. Now, if Hossein wants to take up that there is no necessary features had by, say, all religious traditions or all scientific traditions, right, that might be something that we can get into. But simply saying, oh, these are just institutions, so ultimately they could get along, doesn't really help if it's the fact that they share something by way of being that kind of institution that sets them in conflict. So I think we need to get a little bit deeper than simply saying these are institutions. Of course, I agree, they're institutions. I think that's the biggest point that I would like to point out at the moment. Perhaps the other point very quickly is that I did feel that although I might have laid too much emphasis, say, on the theoretical outputs of science and religion, I felt that Hossein's reference to the COVID epidemic and the supply of vaccines, and this sort of presented science like something of a soup kitchen, handing out. Thank you. Handing out all the goodies to us poor plebs who don't have scientific training and so don't know how to develop the nice things like vaccines and the cars and the stereos and the Zoom apps and so on. I mean, we might, I hope, to avoid talking at cross purposes at least, it might be good if we can, we need to get a bit closer in line of what we're considering to be the outputs of science and religion. And I think that what's more fundamental, at least, to scientific research and study is their theoretical outputs rather than their products, as it were, that we can buy and trade. And I think that's quite an odd view of science, if I'm being honest. But he's welcome to it. Perhaps he thinks I'm putting undue emphasis on theories. Maybe he'd like to address that. But more importantly, I think, is this institutional claim. Of course, science and religion are institutions, but whether they take up particular positions, normative, methodological, or otherwise, that might be the fact that we need to consider with regard to the conflict claim, not just that they are institutions. That won't get us very far, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smith. So
Okay.
let us hear now a 5 minutes rejoinder of Professor Kamali. Yeah,
please hold the time for me. If I go over time, please let me know. Of course, I greatly admire and appreciate the sense of humor, but I don't think of science as. But I also propose that science is not just scientific theories. And religion is not just theology. Religion is not just metaphysical statements. And that is what it means to be dealing with an institution or with institutions, not just propositions and, as I said, not some higher order logic with predicates. And that's exactly what it means. Science is not scientific theories. So religion is not religious theories about God or metaphysics. And it certainly is not about ghosts and goblins and fairies. That is a belittling of one of the most enduring and significant and important human institutions. So it has to be, neither soup kitchen nor ghosts and goblins and fairies. Let me share my screen, if I may, to say what I want to say about what brought me to this question. And I leave a lot of the material for the open debate part where we can actually interact. So let me share my screen at this moment and say what incited me to revisit an old interest in science and religion. So it was a couple of cartoons. So this matter of cartoonish misrepresentation is a big part of this debate, of people on the one side trying to say, okay, these religious people, they are not smart enough. See, they are hanging on to the feet of a white guy who's a scientist sitting at the microscope, and it happens to be a man. And that's it. This is science. Science is scientific theories are going to be rescuing us. And then there's another very insulting and offensive cartoon that I found, and I have covered parts that may be offensive to others as well, that now that science has arrived, now that science has emancipated us from the superstition of ghosts and goblins and fairies, we are going to live with science. This is wrong. This is the essential conflict between science and religion. This is the implication of that. This is an outcome of the myth and the ideology of progress that has hurt human beings in general, to the degree that I'm not going to explain to. So what I am going to engage, and let me stop sharing at this point, is by observing that, first of all, there are statements in religion that are not in conflict with science in any way. I think you agree with that, Tiddy.
2 more minutes.
Right? So love your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Matthew, chapter 22, verses 36, 35, and 37. Citing from the Quran, remember God often. There is nothing in this that is against science. Any method of reasoning about remembering God does not conflict with any scientific methodology of explaining things, I think. Or the Bhagavad Gita that says act for the action itself, not for the fruits of the action. Again, this does not contravene or contradict any scientific explanation. On the other hand, there are important scientific positions that do not in any way contradict religion. Yeah, 2 molecules of hydrogen plus 1 molecule of oxygen give us 2 molecules of water, H2O. How does that conflict with religion? Because you say there must be a conflict. That is the problem. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. This is the most famous equation in science, perhaps. E equals mc squared. How does that contradict? How is that in conflict with any precept of religion? Another one, a third one. All living organisms consist of membranes or membrane-encased cells, and this is called the second law of biology. How does that conflict with the teachings of religion? Yes, there are statements in religion. There are methods of reasoning in religion, we both agree, that may and do, actually not only may, they do conflict. They are different from methods of reasoning in science. However, difference is not always conflict. Let me stop here. Difference is not conflict.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kamali. Now that we have heard the opening statements as well as the rejoinders of both sides of the debate, it's time for inter-panel discussion, or you can call it free debate, which is typically more interesting part. The debaters can now interfere during the other side's talk by interrupting each other if it feels necessary, but the flow of the discussion should be maintained. Now the virtual floor is open for 30 minutes inter-panel discussion. If I may intervene, I have a few questions and I would like you to elaborate on them during inter-panel discussion. Dr. Smith, let me begin with you. What kind of necessity do you mean when you say that there must be a conflict between science and religion? Is it a metaphysical necessity? Is it a logical necessity? And if I may ask from Professor Kamali, one argument that Dr. Smith presented was that the method, okay, if I put it in my own words, the method of science is empirical investigation, while the method of religion is based on authority, or if it is based on investigation, it's not empirical investigation. So I would like to hear your response to that question as well. So the floor is open for 30 minutes, please. Dr. Smith, if you have anything to say at the beginning, and Dr. Kamali, you think that you have to interrupt, feel free. Yeah.
I'm glad that you asked the question of me that you did, because I feel that that's something I might need to clarify a wee bit. I mean, I think it's a little bit unfair to say, for example, water is H2O. How does this conflict with religion? Of course, it doesn't. I mean, or to say, well, for any religion that I'm familiar with, there might be some religions who hold that water is X, Y, Z, whatever. But no, of course, there are many, as I said in my opening statement, there are many scientific claims that do not directly contradict religious claims and vice versa. The point is that sometimes we do find conflict, or rather, sometimes we find contradictions between these claims. And when we do, I believe that we can trace the cause of those differences, of that contradiction, to the way in which the religious claim has been justified. And it will be such that that claim has been justified using methods that were not shared by the scientists. Now, just quickly, you asked about necessity, and I think this is sort of an important point. My point is that this is a necessary feature of religions as a kind of thing, as a kind of institution, right? These are institutions that accept these methods as a way of going about investigating the world. That's what makes them religions, right? There's a reason that spirit possession can be found in Africa and among evangelicals in America. It's not just a strange cosmic quirk, right? They share this as a matter of necessity. Now, the range of methods that they share often claim to derive their authority from a supernatural or non-corporeal authority. And that's sort of the connection there between the authority and the methodology. Just to, quickly add, I think, the idea of, bringing in cartoons or the cartoonish way of doing, I feel like I did present at least the case a little bit more, what's the word? Respectably than maybe
it was the soup kitchen.
Some of these cartoons.
It was the soup kitchen comparison.
But I was.
It was they are equally shallow in terms of adducing evidence. The same way that science is not about throwing religion over the cliff. In the same way that religion's relationship with science is not, okay, wait for the great scientists to tell us what the truth is. Science is also not a soup kitchen, and religion is not reducible religious authority, especially once you look at the concept of religion and not simply as at Christianity over the past 500 years in Europe. Very much different, and this is important. So in interreligious studies that I'm advocating here in the paper that you kindly mentioned, I'm saying that there are different kinds of religious authority, there are different kinds of scientific authority, and there are forms of religious authority that are more amenable to and more open to a scientific understanding of the world. All I'm saying, at the risk of repeating myself many times, is that there is no must in the conflict between science and religion. Science and religion may conflict, absolutely. They sometimes do. They often do. But in order not to talk past each other, the point of this debate today is that must there be a conflict between religion and science? So I think we both agree by this time that there need not be a conflict, but sometimes, especially as you say, in matters of explanation, there is a radical difference in methodology. And this
No, I think you're missing the point actually, Hossein. What I'm arguing is that the conflict is between the methods used by religion and the methods it's not. I think you keep wanting to reduce the conflict to a propositional one, which is funny because that's what you're saying it's not, and it's also what I'm saying it's not, but you refuse to accept that I'm saying it's not, because you want to paint me as saying it is just a conflict between propositions. It's not at all. It's a conflict between those who would say it's respectable to use, for example, a dream as a way of justifying a claim about the world, and those who say it's not. Okay. Now, that's where the conflict lies. It's not the same as saying, this group says water is H2O, but that group doesn't.
So
therefore, there's no necessary conflict, right? That's not how it stands.
So far we have agreed that there need not be a conflict, but there is a conflict.
No, that's not right. No, we disagree on that point. That's why I accepted this debate claim. I wouldn't be arguing for it otherwise.
Examples of no conflict.
No, because you're seeing the conflict as propositional. You're saying, oh, science says water is H2O and religions don't care, so there's no conflict, right? I'm saying it's not about the propositions, it's about how they justify claims. What they do is in conflict. What they do is in conflict.
First of all, your methodological peak is also epistemic and propositional. So you're not talking about something that is not propositional. You're talking about, for example, what you eloquently describe as the principle of methodological naturalism, which is the scientific way of explanation, and the religious, as opposed to the religious way of explanation, which resorts to dreams and goblins, and this is your wording, and goblins and ghosts, etc. I'm saying that this is not the case. And also important, I will leave alone this propositional part for a moment. difference is not the same as conflict. This is another important observation. One may speak French, and one may speak English. And these are two different languages with different rules, but they are not in conflict. They are different ways of expressing ideas, of communicating. So
now I'm going to interrupt here because I have a very good question. So are science and religion then two different ways of knowing, or two different ways of understanding?
Two different ways of understanding. Sometimes.
Okay, there we go. That's where the conflict lies.
No, that's not a conflict, my friend. It's a difference. Let me remind you and our audience of the positions put forward by, Ian Barbour, a famous person who is accredited to have started this science and religion studies field. Whether that is the case or not, he contributed to it, right? As he presents us with a taxonomy of the relationship between science and religion, right? Conflict, independence. Then he talks about
dialogue and integration.
Dialogue, and the other one, integration. So first of all, conflict and independence are not the same thing, right? I do not subscribe to Barbour's taxonomy, but I'm using this for clarification.
Yeah.
Independence and conflict are not the same thing. One could say that science and religion are two independent ways of answering questions about existence. This is not the debate of ours today. This is not the debate question for today. The question you said yes to is that science and religion must be in conflict. An alternative to that is that science and religion may be independent ways of knowing. This is not what I'm saying, but this is a way that may be brought in, and this would falsify your position. But it simply means
it would. But the point of Barbour's independence model is that what religion does successfully is not what science does successfully, right? Now, that's why they're independent, because one can do something that the other can't. So there is a sort of complementarity to it, right? Now, my claim is that if you take science and religion as two distinct ways of knowing, one of these is not a way of knowing or understanding, or whatever word you want to insert there. One of these does not actually deliver knowledge by the means that it claims to deliver it.
Very good. So one of them does not, one could say...
One's dysfunctional.
Okay, I understand that position. But this is why I brought up the question of the COVID-19, especially not as science as soup kitchen, but as a human activity in which non-scientists are as effectively involved in the activity, as fundamentally involved as the science of producing vaccines is. One cannot dismiss the role played by many people who were inspired or, inspired by their faith to serve other people who are suffering. I have a colleague, I want to mention that, who is now 84 years old. He has been, as she puts it, serving God since she was 14 years of age. She spent a large part of her life in India as a Christian, delivering healthcare to Muslim women in India who wouldn't want to be touched by a male physician. So this is not scientific. This is a way of knowing the world, and it's extremely meaningful. It has got nothing with, some utility principle of maximization of one's utility in life, or some other purported scientific explanation of what humans are to do with their lives. I'm very happy that you put your position so clearly and boldly that one, namely religion, is dysfunctional, whereas religion continues to contribute to finding meaning in life. How can we dismiss that as a contribution to understanding? religion may not, and I don't say it doesn't, but I say it may not contribute to our empirical understanding of the world. Good point. But our understanding is not exclusively empirical. And reducing the Shinto priest's observation that we come from the sun, whatever it may mean, to some empirical story by Carl Sagan that, oh yes, nitrogen, carbon came from heaven, came from the sky, came from the sun, is just emptying that statement from meaning. By trying to give it another meaning, one empties it from meaning. So let's go back to what you said. One can say, again, it's not my position, but one could say that science and religion are independent, totally independent. They answer questions differently. They also ask different questions. They ask different questions. And one need not be so cavalier about the meaning production, the productive role of religion in generation of meaning by saying it's dysfunctional and it's all wrong. This is not.
Can I talk about cavalier dismissals, though? I mean, you've
sure.
obviously taken issue with something that I wrote in a paper of mine, where I talked about the occult methods used to justify claims in, for example, goblins, ghosts, etc. And you've picked up on this, I think, because you've mentioned goblins, ghosts a couple of times.
Yes, it
seems to me that
exactly, just as you cited mine, you know.
No, absolutely. I'm not faulting you for that. I'm faulting you for being so cavalier and dismissive of goblins and ghosts. I mean, do you really not see some contradiction there in saying that I should be less cavalier in dismissing, you know, your religious view, for example, and the goblins and ghosts that many people do believe in, you're being just as cavalier about? In fact, you're taking offense at the fact that anyone would compare your God to goblins and ghosts.
Can I
How dare you berate the believers in the goblins and ghosts like this?
Okay.
Are they so silly?
That is a good position, but let me hear from Dr. Mirdamadi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Smith, in order to defend your conflict model, I'm wondering what would be the relation of your essentially conflict model with what is called scientism? Because I think in order to defend your position, I think, and correct me if it's not the case, you have to defend as a presupposition the model that the only kind of enterprise that or discipline that can provide us with knowledge is science. This is one presupposition. On the other hand, you have to actually defend the position that religion also claims things that are usually taken care of by scientists. So that scientism and that kind of religious interference, I suppose, are two presuppositions of your essential conflict model, correct?
Not really. I think any talk of scientism is difficult because if you define science, you know, it's well known by now, I think, that if you define science too narrowly, then, you know, you'd be an idiot to be in favor of scientism. If you were to define it too broadly, well, then of course everyone should be right. Everyone should agree. I think the trouble is that you know, if we take a sort of common sense reading of science as, you know, the sorts of things that are studied in the universities under the School of Science, then no, of course, I don't think that the only way to learn about the world is through that. But that's not. That doesn't mean that I should therefore count that religion is just one of the non-scientific ways. You know, religion is just, in my opinion, not one of the non-scientific ways of learning about the world. And that's just about all I can say. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me, if I may, Dr. Mirdamadi, Dr. Smith, back to what you said. The issue with goblins and ghosts and fairies, I'm not dismissive of those entities, or I'm not. Yeah, that's not where I'm going now. So please don't tell me that I'm dismissive of other people's gods. That is not the point. The point is that you somehow seem to be reducing religion only to these, like soup kitchen, that it's only these dysfunctional ideas.
I think you're being rather disingenuous there to say that you hadn't taken the goblins and ghosts comment as a reduction of the all great high God to something like a superstitious belief.
Look, I don't know what you really believe. As you know, belief is not a predicable concept. The point is that was my impression, that you talk about religion as belief in goblins and fairies, and that's it. There is a lot more to religion than such concepts. They are there. They have meaning. They produce meaning. They generate meaning to people who believe in them, who adhere to them. The dreams may play a role in the formation of one's subjectivity, right, as we know it from anthropological studies, how one's own dreams, and not only one's own dreams, but other people's dreams, may be constitutive of one's life world, right? We know that. This is again, we know this from anthropological investigations or description of how societies function, how individuals function. However, the point is, religion as a complex human institution, I'm trying to emphasize, is not reducible to any of these. As I mentioned earlier, it's not reducible to propositions, not reducible to speculation. It's not also reducible simply to authorities. Again, it's a human institution with ebbs and flows, with currents that have risen and have fallen, and it continues to do so. A reductive approach. You are very clear in rejecting scientism, right? As I hear correctly, you didn't like that label. I understand that. In the same way, one could say this kind of cartoonish, reductive understanding of religion is also something to reject. In the same way that adhering to the ethos of scientific explanation is not the same as scientism. It need not be. It may very well lead to it in some cases. It need not be. In the same way, upholding religion, even goblins and fairies, need not reduce to what you call superstition, right? This is, or to a blind following of authority. Let me say one thing, if I may. Dr. Mirdamadi, how much time do we have? And hope I'm not talking
Mr. Sheikh al-Islami, can you please?
You have about nine more minutes.
Okay,
nine more minutes. Yeah, please.
Let me share what I think, Tiddy. Let me share what I think. To me, it is projectionable. It is objectionable and problematic to smuggle in religion to answer scientific questions. Agreed? Yeah, obviously, right? To bring in religion to account for the fossil record, I think is a problem. I think it is a violation of the scientific methodology. However, I also propose that bringing in scientific evidence to account for the teachings of religion is also objectionable and problematic. That is,
what do you mean by account for there? Because you might talk about cognitive science of religion or something, and that seems to me perfectly reasonable.
I mean something more simple and less sophisticated. Right. So what I have seen by some people of faith is that when they encounter, a passage in the scripture, that is, the famous example is Oppenheimer looking at the explosion in New Mexico, and being reminded of the passage in the Bhagavad Gita, this manifestation of the Brahman there. Now, that kind of reasoning is a big part of Hindu nationalism today. Going back to the Bhagavad Gita to find scientific explanations of the world. Or sometimes by, I would give examples of the Muslim tradition. there was a gentleman in our lifetime, in my lifetime, who said, there is a miracle in the language of scripture because it says there is a word in the scripture that if you translate it into the numerical equivalent, it will be 360. And Rafi al-Darajat means God has created the circle into 360 degrees, which is outright silly, stupid. I have heard some people of faith, when they come to the issue of the biblical statement of going through a rope or a camel going through the eye of a needle, right? Also in the Quran, right? Going through the eye of a needle. And I actually heard this from some physician who said, well, if there is a black hole and the camel becomes so thin that it will go through the needle. And I told her, what happens to the needle? If you are there. These are disingenuous ways of abusing science and abusing religion. This is why I mentioned the abuse of science and religion. The language of science, the language of faith, the language of religion may be different. The ideas need not be radically incommensurable, but there are different ways of expression. But this is important. So I'm not talking about an independence and incommensurability between religion and science. That's another position. I don't take that position. However, think about what sometimes we refer to as constitutive laws, right? And because it has been so abused, this word of games, it has been misabused so much. But for lack of a better term, I want to use the word activity, and that's what I did earlier. If we look at science as a human activity with certain rules, ground rules, right? And when one does scientific research, when one asks empirical questions, one ought to be bound by the principles of this activity. Repeatability, falsifiability, whatever it is, simplicity, Occam's razor, etc. But when one engages in religious discourse, for example, in my line of work, I've had some students who are chaplains, right? They work in hospitals.
Who are what? I didn't.
They're chaplains. They work in hospitals.
Chaplains. Sorry, yep.
They're hospital chaplains or prison chaplains. And when I taught a class on ethics, contemporary ethics, or and when I talked about questions like euthanasia, when I talked about ethics to them, when I presented, these very common thought experiments in ethics, such as the trolley problem, how do we decide? How do we make decisions? And from a human perspective, and these are chaplains, they are religious, they serve religious communities. It's a totally different encounter to hold the hand of a person who has a dying parent or a dying spouse to come up with meaning. In this case, what they rely on is not science. In the case of my students, they rely on religion and on faith. One could rely on other things, perhaps. However, to them, the questions of ethics were not reducible to some scientific. Life is not just a scientific phenomenon, right? Not just a set of signals. And dealing with life, even though science deals with life, absolutely, every day, but religion does too. Religion generates meaning for the people who are going through this. And it's not simply dysfunctional. Definitely it serves a purpose. You could take back the word dysfunctional and say, well, it works, but it's untrue. Right? One could say that. But however, how would you go about understanding truth?
Well, I think the how I'd characterize the dysfunctional nature of the methods there is that when independent investigators apply the same methods, they come to completely different conclusions. So to the same questions, that is, right?
That is perfectly fine. Repeatability is an ethos of science. It may not be an ethos of lived experience. We live once. We experience things once. This repeatability and
So,
privilege and defeatability.
okay,
That
so
is
those who
what
say
defines.
that to appease or to, you know, to please God, we should feed the hungry, and those who say to please God, we should perform human sacrifice, this is just because we only live once. It's no clue to the unreliability of the methods involved. I mean,
Excellent
I think,
example. Excellent
yeah.
example. What would be more meaningful to the broader human community?
I imagine the human sacrifice, that's a hell of an event, has a lot of meaning, right?
Well,
I mean,
take that as a facetious remark. But
no, I take that as you said, which has more meaning, and I swear
doesn't.
that
No,
if I
why
ever
does it
witnessed
have?
a,
Why? Because it has more bang, but more bang is not more meaning.
2 more
I
minutes.
remember it for longer.
What kind of an understanding of meaning is this show effect? That is itself a problem. That is itself a symptom of this maximizing.
Right. So you're saying
maximizing
so are you saying there that the human sacrifice to please God conclusion there would have been the wrong one, or are you just saying, oh well, different times, different conclusions, we only live once? I'm not sure what you're saying.
I'm not judging. There is no need for me to judge because it's not about what I believe.
I think you should be judging that the
this
human
discussion is
sacrifice
not
to
about
please
what I
God is
believe
bad.
or not. This discussion is a rational discussion about a essential and inevitable conflict between science and religion. It's not
Yeah, and
about
it's because
what I believe. It's not about what I believe or what I don't believe. How I treat some religion I don't know about. It's not about that. It's about dismissing religion as being dysfunctional.
yeah, dysfunctional because some say kill the people or kill the heretics, and the others say treat the heretics with love. I mean, these are completely different conclusions. They can be drawn by the same methods in each case.
Another teaching, yes, absolutely. But another teaching of religion is, as I cited Matthew, love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Yes, that's why they contradict. That's why they generate, because some say kill your neighbor, and some
perfect. Okay,
yeah, but you're saying that.
No,
can I interrupt, because you did have quite a talk earlier?
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. I just want to say that the point that I'm trying to make when I say that it's dysfunctional is that they generate disagreeing or disagreement in their outputs when they're applied to the same questions, right?
Time is up.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, can you
just for the record, the results produced by the science of the Nazis was not contradictory to the issues and to the values that we uphold today. Are you saying that?
Yes, but I don't think that science is fit to judge normative claims. I don't think that it has the tools to do that either, and I don't think religion has. That's for damn sure.
Okay, so we are left out there, probably with some other rational discipline, maybe philosophy, right?
Maybe, hopefully.
Maybe. Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Smith, if I ask you a question that I ask at the beginning of interpanel discussion, and I ask, please provide a very short answer. What kind of necessity do you think is the conflict between science and religion? Is it logical, metaphysical, epistemological, or any other kinds of necessity?
Well, it's a logical necessity, I think, in the fact that when you want to define what a religion, well, I mean, you might call this a metaphysical necessity, really. I mean, when we want to pick out in the world what sorts of things are religion, we need to look for the features the religions share. Right? Now, some would say there are no features that all religions share. I actually think that we can look to the methods that they use in justifying their knowledge claims. That's what we mean when we pick out a particular kind of activity as religious, or a particular kind of community as religious. So, so when I say that it's necessary that there's a conflict, I mean that to do religious things or to be a member of a religious community, you have to perform certain things that will necessarily conflict with religion. You can't be religious and simply do everything that the scientist does. You have to have something extra.
And that necessary conflict is logical or rather metaphysical, you said. Yeah, correct?
Yes, well, I think that's right.
Lovely. And very quickly, if I reiterate my question from Professor Kamali, so what would be, very shortly, what would be your answer to this objection that the scientific method is empirical investigation, while in religion either there is imitation, blind or otherwise, or if there is investigation that is not empirical.
Need not be empirical. Again, I draw on the analogy with language. With one may speak in different languages without claiming that the underlying concepts, underlying problems are incommensurable. No, they may be, some of them at least, may be commensurable. They address the same questions, offer answers sometimes for the same problems, and conflict is possible. Conflict is not inevitable, and conflict is harmful. A conflict model is a harmful and deleterious to human interests. So I will say a few words about this in the conclusion. This is my position. I've repeated it many times. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you both. Now let us hear the closing statement of Dr. Smith for 5 minutes, please. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much for the debate. I think things may have got a bit testy from time to time, but I think that's actually excellent when it comes to discussing these sorts of very deep and important questions.
These are serious questions.
Yes, if we didn't get upset about these kinds of questions, then what the hell should we get upset about, right? So yes, thank you for the feisty discussion. It's been great. Now, yes, for my closing comments, I think it might be best if I sort of maybe begin with some of the points of agreement that I think me and Hossein have actually shared through the course of the debate so far. It seems as though we've both agreed that there's more to religion and science than simply sets of propositions, sets of claims. These are institutions, these are very human institutions, and they have at their core human aims and goals to be achieved. And that is important to remember. At the same time, where I think me and Hossein disagree is about what it is that these institutions are set up to actually try to do. And it seems as though the difference has had to do with, as Hossein said, a difference in, say, languages, right? So he used the example of French and English, and one can speak French, one can speak English. That need not mean there's any kind of conflict, right? And sometimes he might have wanted to add, we can even perform something like a translation and come to some sort of deeper understanding of what is going on in each of these languages, right? And what they share. Now, I think if I can put my disagreement with Hossein in his own analogy, therefore perhaps as starkly as possible, it seems to me that whereas the scientist is going about speaking French with the aim of communication at its core, the religious believer in using particular religious methods is in fact, if anything, speaking gibberish, right? There is no shared purpose between these two activities, or rather, there is, let me rephrase that, there is a shared purpose, okay? They both claim to be aiming at communication. One of them just radically falls short of the mark. That's probably where I'd like to end. And once again, I'd like to thank Hossein very much for his contribution. It was very, very interesting to hear his point of view. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. So now let us hear the closing statement of Professor Kamali for 5 minutes, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mirdamadi. Thank you so much, Tiddy, for the conclusion. I'm not going to read from a statement, not all of it. I'll pursue with what you said. Our debate today was not about the veracity of religion. Our debate today was not about the truth claims of religion. Our debate today, the question was, must there be conflict between science and religion? And on many levels, that is on a propositional, theoretical, epistemological level, there need not be a conflict. There may be a difference, there may be an independence. And what I suggest is that it is possible for there to be a conversation. Well, once you say one party is speaking a language and the other party is speaking gibberish, or is mute, is dumb mute, is just making noises, that precludes communication. That is maybe it doesn't serve the claim that you make about conflict, but it certainly contributes and supports the position of independence. So one is saying something and the other one is just making noise, and there is no correspondence between languages. Right? These two so-called life worlds or language games do not speak to each other. Right? One of them is dysfunctional, as you say, is to be eliminated. But the problem is, just with our 1.5 hour discussion, it's not going to fly, and it's not going to hold water. It is a, I have to be careful with my words because I don't mean to be, again, cavalier, but we have a large number of people, human beings, and we are all in the same storm. We are all caught in the same environmental crisis. It is not enough to dismiss the point of view of a large part of humanity. And I'm not talking about majority, minority. No, I'm talking about a large part of humanity by dismissing what they hold near and dear, what their understanding of the meaning of life and the world is, as individuals and as groups, and to say, okay, you don't understand. It's science that is actually trying to communicate and to tell you something. Follow us. Well, this is not a responsible position. But let me, now I will turn to what I want to say at the end, what my attempt is. This is what I want to do. I may say this. The problem with publishing, with printing things is that then it becomes difficult to find the pages you want to read from. However, this is what I want to say. Epistemic principles. For example, the epistemic principle we know as methodological naturalism. Even logic. Such epistemological principles exist within life worlds. We need to draw attention to the ethical dimension of rationality, as well as this detached, very detached, not value-laden understanding of methodological naturalism. But this is it, and this is the only way. This is the, or within some range of probabilities, this is what it is. Instead, I think we should capitalize on the shared ethical foundation that is relevant to human beings. I agree that we have scientific values, repeatability, simplicity, refutability. But again, there is more. Scientific truth is simultaneously revealing its exposure, and at the same time, it's concealing and obscuring. Exactly comes out of what you said. I agree that religious truth may be the same. Religious claims to truth, if you want me to qualify it, are maybe simultaneously revealing and exposing and giving us exposure, and at the same time, they are concealing and they are obscuring. This is the nature of human language. This is the nature of our cognitive ability. Our concepts, again, to use the wording of some other people, I'm using their words without mentioning names, the concepts in which we think, the concepts in which thought expresses itself, stand against a wall of darkness, whether these are scientific concepts or they are religious concepts. Let's hold true about scientific and religious thought, both of which are embodied in and mediated through institutions. This is the claim that I. And what I calling for is not the conflict model, but the fusion of horizons. This is what I'm calling a fusion of horizons, allowing French speakers and English speakers to find common ground. Therefore, unlike Quine, I do not adhere to the untranslatability principle, right? It's a very powerful position. I do not uphold the incommensurability understanding of science and paradigms, or, etc. What I'm calling for is taking note of the dire human condition and calling for a fusion of various horizons. And what we call religion is not one thing. It's only in the context of Europe that one religion makes sense. we have religions, we have many religions, we have many ways of looking at the world, and various religions are part of it. And in that sense, I don't see that science and religion must be in. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate your comments, your analytic approach, and I also thank Dr. Mirdamadi and everyone at the ICCNC and everyone in the audience who put up with my somewhat not always smooth presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for Q&A. I'm gonna combine some questions because I think they are well relevant. So the first question is, can speakers define science and religion? And I'm gonna ask also another question, which I think is quite relevant to the definition of science and religion from both sides. So Smith's point is more on epistemology. Kamali's point is institutionalization and conduct of science as an institution. I think they are talking past each other so far. So maybe in order not to do that, if you do, it would be good if you come up with a definition of science and religion, if you think definition is quite helpful to clear your position in this debate. Tiddy, you first, please.
Yeah, that's one hell of a question. No, I think the questioner is quite right, though, that there was probably a good deal of talking past each other, but I think that's only natural in this kind of debate where you are talking about such large institutions with so many differences across time and place as science and religion. Science, I guess I would say an institution, institutional or organized investigation into the natural world by means of appeal to, well, yes, I mean, one way to put it would be the empirical methods of justification. So those which tend to generate intersubjective agreement between independent investigators. Religion, I would define as, again, communities or institutions who share in common certain core beliefs, and also as an important addendum to that, who go about or with practices of justification that are dependent on certain denizens of their worldview, right? Notably the supernatural beings who are typically responsible for ensuring the reliability, or supposedly ensuring the reliability, of the methods of justification used. Those are the worst definitions of science and religion you'll ever hear, but that was my attempt at a very off-the-cuff sort of account. So there we are.
Okay, Hossein, you too, please. How do you define science and religion?
So without evading the question, I will make a statement that definitions are not very useful. And definitions belong to another form of discourse. And as a historian, and my point of view is historical, science is what we know as science in our time. That is, especially and in particular, the institution of scientific activity over the past 500 years or so, a modern science that gives us a picture of the world, our world, in empirical terms, using empirical methods of justification or falsification. I'm not very much a fan of justification, I have to say, but that is a matter of
another point on which we agree. Well done.
We could
Lovely.
discuss that. However, definitions are not helpful. We have an activity known as science, very commonly practiced and available. We know institutions of science, and at the same time, we have a general idea of this phenomenon called religion. There is religious authority. It's not only that. Again, if you see it, you know it. It's very much like that judge that made a comment about another human form of expression. Once you see it, you can tell what it is. So I'm not going to try and attempt to reduce either science or religion to some kind of essence. Now, about talking past each other, I think that's inevitable in a good conversation. If we actually aim to bring people to fuse horizons, there is bound to be some fundamental difference, some fundamental differences. We talk about the same things, we talk about them differently, we talk about different things, we talk about them in similar manners. So this is an hour-long debate, and it's only acceptable because we are not journalists, we are not reading off a script. That is where there is no need to talk past each other. You know, you're not watching television, you're looking at an intellectual exchange. And a big part of intellectual exchange is an attempt to understand what the other party is saying. Neither of us, and I'm very grateful to Tiddy, was reading a statement here only, right? We actually engaged in conversation. We thought. We came up, with this analogy of language being so important. You know, language constitutes our world. Again, some other clever philosopher said that. And the language of science, the language of religion, I don't think the language of religion is gibberish. But again, that's the point we may disagree on, right? So I think this was a substantive conversation that we had, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Also, we have received a bunch of statements, not question as such, but let me read it out loud. It might be useful. Okay. One is this: religion and science are not in conflict or independent. Instead, both institutions answer different questions. Science is a part of science, and religion encourages science. So what do you think of that statement, Dr. Smith?
Yes, well, the last bit I didn't quite hear. Sorry, science is a part of science, I thought you said. No, I got confused.
Yeah, okay. Okay, let me find. Science is part of science, and science is science. We can interpret it this way. And religion encourages science. Okay.
Well, certainly some religions do, some religions don't. And again, I think this is just a consequence of the fact that they are all using the same tools and coming to different conclusions, which is not a very good sign of reliability. You know, the fact that some religions are very pro-science, others, say the Amish communities and the Pennsylvania and that, and not especially pro-science. So again, it really depends on what sort of tea you're brewing. All the religions seem to be using the same kettle, the same water, and all that, but the tea always comes out different. So something's up. That's all I can say.
Okay, Professor Kamali, you please.
Well, I mean, it was a comment, as you said, and it was not germane to the topics that we discussed. It was not directly relevant to arguments that we made.
Okay, okay.
So they said that they are not in conflict, but they're not independent. But then one is what it is, and the other one includes the other one or calls to it. So it's a very different line of reasoning from what we engaged in.
Okay.
Good statement.
I mean, another thing, if I can add a comment, in these sorts of debates as well, a real problem that you can often encounter, and I'm really pleased actually that Hossein stayed clear of this, because this can make things really, really messy, is when the no true Scotsmen start coming out. And if I say, but you know, some religions are actually terribly anti-science, and then they say, no, but I'm only talking about all the real religion, right? All the true religions.
Well, we know ways of we admonish our students about fallacies, and one of them is the true Scotsman, or the true Muslim for that matter, or the true Christian.
Exactly. Oh yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, and here is another question. What are questions that science and religion try and able to answer by their methods? So
well, I'll just quickly give an example. How old is the universe? Right. That would be a rather simple one, I think, to start with, or questions about, say, what the cause of human beings is, what has caused human beings to come about. That would be another question. I mean, that's just to give a couple of examples that are well known. Was there a global flood ever? Scriptural religions, of course, are big on this. Abrahamic religions. So.
And naturally enough, your position is that religion is not able to come up with a reasonable answer to these questions.
Well, I do want to maybe just make a distinction here, and by the sounds of things, Hossein might be a bit leaning towards the critical rationalist kind of side of things as well, so perhaps he'd like this, but it's important to make a distinction, I think, between what Popper called the context of discovery and the context of justification, right? So it might be the case that, like I said with my example from Shinto early on, they say the Japanese are descended from the sun. Well, in some sense, that's actually true. It's, they miraculously sort of hypothesized this thing, conjectured it, and it came out to be somewhat in the right direction. Maybe not by quite the route that they were picturing, but the real question, I think, is how you then take those claims that have been conjectured, whether they're true or not, and go about trying to prove or falsify them. And that's, I think, where the real differences come about. Both religion and science conjecture to high heaven. Yes.
Dr. Kamali, you?
May I just say that even though it's been a long time since I have followed the literature on philosophy of science, if I remember correctly, the distinction between context of discovery and context of justification was made by Reichenbach. And Popper took it from. But anyway,
yeah, I think it was even earlier than Reichenbach. Actually, I think
I may be wrong, but that's what I remember from.
Yeah. It is before Popper, but Popper has his own special.
Definitely, Popper has his own
definition.
Appropriating other people's ideas. That's very true, and putting them in his own very eloquent words. However, I use Tiddy's example. When did the universe begin? Is there a beginning to the universe? Was there a Big Bang, for example? Was there a moment of origin, the Big Bang as we call it now? Or was there a creative moment? Was there a moment in which God created them? These are, I think, two different ways of approaching the question of origins. This is where I said it would be equally wrong to use the idea of Big Bang to argue for a creation by God, as it would be wrong to explain the Big Bang with the idea of God. But this is where I think we are abusing, we are mixing the two languages. This is like talking in, there is a very problematic book, very flawed book, a Syrian Aramaic reading of the Quran. The author takes the Arabic text and tries to read it as a Syro-Aramaic text. Well, it is possible if you try to read the German text as an English text. It's possible you'll find some words that are there. But it's a very stupid attempt, I think. It is a terribly stupid attempt, right? It has had precedents. Some artisans in Persia who didn't know Arabic tried to read the Quran as a Persian book, right? And that's a big flaw. That's a big methodological mistake. That's a very stupid thing to do. And I think reading science, doing science in the name of religion is a big mistake. In the same way, it is a big mistake for science, or to claim to give scientific alternatives for the real important fundamental questions of religion. And religion, of course, is the realm of interpretations. There are many, many possible interpretations, and religion gives answers. I don't think to any of these important questions that you highlighted, all religions or even one religion at all times is agreed on one answer. There are different voices. This is what
2 more minutes.
There are different voices involved. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Let me, since we have only a few minutes, there are a number of questions that are specifically in terms of its content, they are addressed to Professor Kamali. So let me read both of them, then Dr. Kamali have a few minutes to miraculously answer both of them.
I am incapable of performing miracles. I will say that as a student of science and a student of religion. So,
okay. First question, if we only live once and repeatability cannot be applied to religious sources of epistemology, then how could we test those claims? I mean, he or she means religious claims. This is the first question. The second one is French and English can be easily translated mutually. How do you translate religion and science mutually, given the fact that there are many religious beliefs that are exclusively accepted by believers? Okay.
Both are good questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
The first one, please remind me, I just didn't write it down, but the first part was, could you please repeat that?
Sure. If we live only once and repeatability,
yes, live once. Thank you.
Apply. Yeah.
The answer is we don't test. You don't test. Testing is an empirical approach, empirical method. Just as you don't test the paintings of Dali, for example. What is the relationship between the time warp of Dali and chronological time? Nothing. There is no relationship. It's not a very intelligent question posed. When you go to an art museum, you don't look at justifying or testing the artwork. It doesn't work at all. It is a way of, it's a very reductive approach. Yes, you live once, and this is a very important idea. There's some smart philosopher once said that the most important problem for all humans is that they die. Death, live only once. This is a very profound observation. It's not like tossing coins in the theory of probability. There is no law of large numbers. You live once as an individual. You live once. This is a huge, huge teaching of religion, that you are born alone, you die alone, and in some religions you are resurrected alone. You don't test this. Nobody has come from the other side to tell you that this is it, this is what happens, unless in some dream. And this is a very profound thing. You have one gamble to make. You don't test. There is no law of large numbers. And I think it's significant. The other one about translatability, I mentioned that I'm not a follower of Quine and his essential untranslatability principle. However, translation is a very complicated issue. As a person who has actually worked on artificial intelligence and and machine translation, I would tell you that translation is a very complicated matter. And other than some kind of a Chinese room experiment where you have a big amount of data and the computer translates, that is not how humans use language. That is not how human translators use language. I have worked personally as a simultaneous translator at the United Nations, so I know it is not a mechanical activity. In the same way, appreciating science and appreciating religion is not a mechanical exercise. It's an existential exercise to be able to see the world as coming from nothing. You know, it's very important to look at the world as a scientist, ask questions like a scientist. And then also to me at least, it's significant, ask questions as a person of faith. And these are very different ways. And to me, I can't say they complement each other, but there are two experiential modes. And that makes sense. I think it makes a lot of sense to look at translation, cultural translation, personal translation, not as a mechanical act, but as a deeply immersive experience. Thank you. I think I have talked too much, and this is the time to bring this to a close.
Yeah, okay. On behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, I would like to thank Dr. Tiddy Smith and Professor Hossein Kamali for their intriguing and at times heated debate. And also I would like to thank the people in the audience, wherever you are. If you are interested in this debate series, please stay tuned. Each season we will have one such debate. It is always free and no registration is needed. So thank you, Dr. Kamali and Dr. Smith. And I enjoyed it a lot. Even that heated debate moments. That was interesting.
Especially the heated part. Thank you, Tiddy. That was great. Thank you, Yaser.
Thank you very much.
ICCNC, everyone, for organizing this and having me part of it. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. As we say in Farsi, Khoda Hafiz. Goodbye.
Take care of yourself.